The detective who arranged the kidnapping was assigned to investigate it. The man put on trial for British espionage was judged by a tribunal that included an actual British spy, and the main suspect walked free twice for 2 different murders. This is the story of Dr. Cronin. On the morning of May 22, 1889, employees of the Chicago Department of Public Works received a complaint about a blocked sewer near the intersection of Broadway and Foster Avenue in the Lakeview district. The smell had been spreading through the neighborhood for days. They came with tools to clear the pipe. When they reached the catch basin, they found the obstruction. A man's body was wedged into the drain, naked, a bloodied towel wrapped around his neck. Beneath the towel, still fastened to his skin, a small medallion, an Agnus Dei pressed tin stamped with the image of the Lamb of God, the kind worn by devout Catholics as a protection against harm. The coroner would count 5 wounds on the skull, each one made by something sharp and narrow, driven with force. The neck was broken. The cheek and temple showed the marks of a blunt instrument. The body had been in the sewer for 18 days. The man's name was Dr. Patrick Henry Cronin. He had disappeared on the night of May 4th, 18 days earlier, after climbing into a carriage with a white horse outside his home on North Clark Street. Before anyone could understand how he ended up in that drain, they first had to understand what kind of man would be put there. The evening of May 4th, 1889, Cronin was preparing to attend a meeting of the Celto-American Society. He was at his residence, a set of rooms he rented from a couple named Theo and Cordelia Conklin on North Clark Street. A man appeared at the door. One of Patrick O'Sullivan's workers had been hurt at the ice house in Lakeview. The doctor was needed immediately. Cronin was O'Sullivan's company physician. He had agreed to the arrangement some months earlier, $8 a month, in exchange for attending to injuries at O'Sullivan's ice storage business. He took his medical bag and went outside. Several neighbors saw him get into the carriage. The horse was white. The buggy had 2 seats. The man driving it was not O'Sullivan. Cronin sat down, and the carriage moved north. He did not come back that night. The Conklins noticed 2 things the following morning. Cronin had not taken his revolver. When he traveled any significant distance, he carried it. He had also taken very little money. The Conklins drove out to Lakeview the next day and asked Patrick O'Sullivan about the injured worker. O'Sullivan told them he had no idea what they were talking about. All 4 of his employees were in good health. None of them had sent for a doctor. Patrick Henry Cronin was born on August 7, 1846, in Butavant, County Cork, in the south of Ireland. His family left for America when he was still an infant. They moved through New York, then Baltimore, then across the border to Ontario. At 10 years old, Cronin enrolled at the Academy of St. Catherine's. He graduated with honors in 1863. For the next few years, he taught school in Pennsylvania. In 1867, he moved west, eventually settling in St. Louis, Missouri. In St. Louis, Cronin was the kind of person people took notice of. He had a tenor voice of unusual quality. He sang at Irish community events, at his local Catholic church, and at the Second Baptist Church on Sundays, a peculiar arrangement for a devout Catholic, but Cronin moved between communities with ease. The singing brought him to the attention of wealthy St. Louis businessmen. They paid for his education. He studied pharmacy first, then switched to medicine and graduated from the Missouri Medical College. He continued at St. Louis University, earning a master's degree and a doctorate. By the early 1880s, he held a professorship in eye and ear diseases at the St. Louis College of Physicians and Surgeons, a college he had helped to revive. In 1878, he traveled to Paris as one of Missouri's state commissioners to the Exposition Universelle. In 1882, he moved to Chicago. He opened a private practice with 2 offices, one downtown and one at his residence. He sang at Holy Name Cathedral and at Irish events across the city. He joined the Foresters, the Royal League, the Royal Arcanum, the Ancient Order of Hibernians, and he remained a member of Clan na Gael, the organization he had joined in St. Louis in 1876. Clan na Gael had been founded in 1869 to replace the Fenian Brotherhood, which had been discredited in the United States after a failed attempt to invade Canada in 1866. The new organization was modeled on fraternal societies, secret codes, initiation rites, oaths of loyalty. Its members called it the United Brotherhood. The public called it Clan na Gael. It had approximately 10,000 members, organized into local chapters called camps, spread across every major American city. Camp 20 in Chicago was the national headquarters. At a convention in Chicago in 1881, the organization voted to consolidate its finances under a 5-man executive board. The camps were required to submit their revenues to the board each year. The total reached close to $100,000 annually. The board did not itemize how the money was spent. The explanation given was that the Irish cause required extraordinary expenses that could not be made public. The board was controlled by 3 of its 5 members: Alexander Sullivan, a Chicago attorney; Michael Boland of Louisville; Dennis Feely of Rochester. In internal correspondence, they were identified by a triangle symbol. Their associates called them, informally, the Triangle. Between 1881 and 1885, bombs exploded in England: the Tower of London, the Houses of Parliament, London Bridge. 29 men with connections to Irish Republican organizations were extradited from the United States. The Triangle denied any link to the attacks. They also refused to account for where the money had gone. When camps began to protest in 1885 and demanded an audit, those camps were expelled from the organization. The money collected from families to support the widows and children of the men killed and imprisoned during these operations. That money, too, had disappeared. No accounting was produced. Cronin asked where it had gone. Cronin had become, by the mid-1880s, the most prominent voice opposing the Triangle within Clan na Gael. He demanded a full accounting of the funds. He accused Sullivan of embezzling from the pension reserves set aside for the families of dead and imprisoned members. Sullivan's response was to charge Cronin with treason against the Irish cause. In 1885, Camp 20 convened an internal tribunal to try Cronin. 5 men sat in judgment. Among them, Daniel Coughlin, a detective in the Chicago Police Department, and a man named Henri Le Caron. Le Caron had been a member of Clan na Gael since the early 1870s. He was also a British intelligence agent. His real name was Thomas Miller Beach. He had been passing information to the British government for years. The dynamite campaign had failed in large part because every plan was transmitted to London before it could be carried out. Men had died. Others were serving long prison sentences. The operations never had a chance. Cronin suspected there was a spy inside the organization. He had pointed toward Sullivan's circle. He was correct. The tribunal that found him guilty of acting as a British agent included a man who was, in fact, a British agent. The panel voted to expel Cronin from Clan na Gael. The decision had an unintended result. Thousands of members refused to accept it. They resigned and formed their own pro-Cronin camps across the country. The organization fractured. By 1888, leaders on both sides had grown tired of the split. They arranged an internal investigation in New York, 5 months of hearings into the charges against Sullivan. Sullivan was cleared. Cronin rejected the outcome and said he would make his evidence public. Sullivan was reported by witnesses to have said that he wished Cronin could be removed. On February 8, 1889, Camp 20 passed a secret resolution declaring Cronin a British agent. The resolution carried formal weight within the organization's internal rules. Anyone who understood those rules understood what it meant. Cronin understood. He told friends in the spring of 1889 that his life was in danger. He accepted the job with O'Sullivan's ice company anyway. Patrick O'Sullivan had approached Cronin with the offer sometime in early 1889. The terms were simple: $8 a month in exchange for responding whenever one of O'Sullivan's workers needed medical attention. The arrangement did not hold up to examination. O'Sullivan employed 4 men. Their work was the storage and delivery of ice. It was not hazardous work. O'Sullivan's ice house was in Lake View, at a considerable distance from Cronin's offices and residence. No other physician near the ice house had been asked to fill the role. O'Sullivan had sought out Cronin specifically and approached him directly. Cronin agreed to the contract. On March 20, 1889, a man called at a Lakeview property owned by a Swedish immigrant named Jonas Carlson. The man gave his name as Frank Williams. He said his brother and an invalid sister would be moving into the vacant cottage soon and paid several weeks' rent. He had furniture delivered: a table, chairs, a sofa, and a large trunk. No one moved in. The cottage sat empty. Occasionally, late at night, lights burned in the windows. Williams was almost never seen at the property. Carlson noted him on the porch once, on the evening of May 4th. He heard 2 men talking loudly inside later that same night. The cottage was 1 block from the offices of O'Sullivan's Ice Company. When Theo Conklin reported Cronin's disappearance to police, the investigation was assigned to Detective Daniel Coughlin. Coughlin reported that he and other officers had searched thoroughly and found no trace of Cronin or any crime. Around 2 in the morning on May 5th, 2 Lakeview police officers had watched a carpenter's wagon carrying a large trunk moving north at speed along Clark Street. They stopped the same wagon on its return trip, now without the trunk. The 2 men driving it gave no reason for concern. The officers let them go. At dawn on May 5th, passers-by found a large trunk on the side of Evanston Avenue. Inside, cotton batting soaked through with blood. On May 9th, a woman named Annie Murphy, known in Irish community circles across the city, came forward to report that she had seen Cronin on a Clark Street streetcar late on the night of May 4th. The conductor confirmed it. The sighting was reported to the police. It became part of the record. On May 10th, Chicago's morning newspapers received dispatches filed from Toronto by a reporter named Charles Long. The dispatches reported that Cronin was alive and well in Canada. He had admitted to being a British spy. He appeared, Long wrote, to be slightly deranged. He was making his way to England to testify against Clan Gael. The dispatches were specific, dated, and attributed. Sullivan's supporters took the dispatches as confirmation. Other rumors circulated in the press. Cronin was fleeing a prosecution for performing an illegal operation. Cronin was avoiding the consequences of a romantic affair. The coverage ran for days. The body was in the sewer on Foster Avenue throughout. On May 22nd, the day the body was found, the Conklins identified Cronin at the Lakeview Police Station morgue. Police traced the bloodied trunk and the furniture in the Lakeview cottage to Revell's furniture store on the north side. The items had been rented by a man who gave his name as J.B. Simmons. The description matched a man known as Patrick Cooney, called the Fox by those who knew him, a familiar associate of both O'Sullivan and Coughlin, and a documented enemy of Cronin. By the time police went looking for Cooney, he was gone. Inside the cotton batting found with the bloody trunk, investigators found a man's severed finger. None of the other suspects under consideration was missing a finger. Jonas Carlson had entered the vacant cottage on May 18th, 4 days before the body was discovered. After growing suspicious of the silence, he found blood in the front room and in several of the other rooms. The floor had been repainted in the last few days. The paint was yellow, applied unevenly in a hurry. Beneath it, the boards were dark. The broken furniture had been pushed against the walls. Police located the livery stable on North Clark Street, where the white horse and buggy had originated. The stable owner told Chief of Police George Hubbard that on the afternoon of May 4th, a man had come to the stable and arranged for a horse and buggy to be available for a friend that evening. The man who came to make the arrangement was Daniel Coughlin. The friend, when he came to collect the horse, gave his name as Smith. Police identified him as John Kunzel, a laborer and a friend of Coughlin's. Frank Woodruff was arrested when he attempted to sell the same horse and buggy to a stable owner who notified police of the suspicious offer. Woodruff confessed to having transported a trunk in his wagon around 2 in the morning on May 5th. His account of the circumstances was as follows. A nervous Patrick Henry Cronin had flagged him down on the street and asked for help loading a trunk that contained, Woodruff claimed, the mutilated body of a woman. The prosecution did not find this version persuasive. Cronin's clothing, cut from his body on the night of the murder, turned up in November 1889. It was found in a storm drain at the corner of Broadway and Buena Avenue, a few blocks from where his body had been discovered. Martin Burke, the man who had rented the cottage as Frank Williams, was located in Winnipeg, Canada, in June, traveling under yet another alias. He was attempting to reach Liverpool. He was extradited to Chicago after a contested legal proceeding. Alexander Sullivan was arrested on June 11th. He was held overnight and released the following morning. There was not enough evidence, the police said, to charge him. He posted $20,000 bail on a coroner's warrant, and the charges were eventually dropped. It was the second time in Sullivan's life that he had been arrested in connection with a killing. In 1876, he had shot and killed a man named Frank Hanford, the principal of the school where Sullivan's wife was a teacher. After Hanford accused her of creating divisions on the school board, Sullivan stood trial twice. He was acquitted both times. Jury selection began on August 26, 1889. It ran for nearly 2 months. Chicago's newspapers had covered the investigation from the first day of Cronin's disappearance through every arrest. Finding 12 people without a fixed opinion about the case required eliminating almost everyone who read. The trial began on October 23rd. 5,000 people came to the courthouse on the opening day. The courtroom held 200. Over 7 weeks, the prosecution and defense called 190 witnesses. Many of them acknowledged, under oath, their membership in Clan na Gael. Several testified that they had been approached before May 4th and asked whether they would be willing to cause harm to Cronin. Some had refused. Their refusals were documented in letters and in the record of a separate internal Clan na Gael inquiry. The prosecution framed what had happened in terms of institutional authority. Cronin had been condemned by an organization that served simultaneously as his accuser, his judge, and his executioner. That organization then used its members inside the Chicago Police Department to abduct him, kill him, and conduct the investigation into his own disappearance. The defense described Cronin as an unstable radical and a confirmed British agent whose disappearance required no further explanation. But the prosecution had something else. Juror Charles C. Dix came forward during the trial to report that a bailiff had approached him with an offer. Dix turned over the evidence to state's attorney Joel Longnecker. The attempt was documented. Closing arguments ran from November 29th through December 12th. The jurors went into deliberation. They deliberated for 70 hours. I spent a lot of time researching and editing this one. If you've watched it, I'd really appreciate you describing it in just 2 words in the comments. Thanks. On December 16, 1889, the jury returned its verdicts. Martin Burke, guilty of murder in the first degree, life in prison. Patrick O'Sullivan, guilty of murder in the first degree, life in prison. Daniel Coughlin, guilty of murder in the first degree, life in prison. John Kunzel, guilty of manslaughter, 3 years. John Beggs, not guilty. Burke and O'Sullivan died in the Illinois State Penitentiary in 1892. Kunzel appealed. At his second trial, he was acquitted. Coughlin appealed on the grounds that 2 jurors had been prejudiced against him. He was granted a new trial. At the second proceeding, the jury acquitted him. The belief among those who followed the case closely was that the jury had been bribed. After his release, Coughlin opened a saloon in Chicago. He was later indicted on charges of bribing jurors in civil damage cases while working for the Illinois Railway Company. When the indictments came down, he left the country. He spent the remainder of his years in Honduras. Patrick Cooney was never found. Alexander Sullivan was never charged. Cronin's funeral, held on May 26, 1889, drew the largest crowds the city of Chicago had seen since Abraham Lincoln's body arrived there in 1865. On Saturday, May 25th, nearly 12,000 people passed through Cavalry Armory on Michigan Avenue to view the closed casket. The body was too damaged and too decomposed to be displayed. On Sunday morning, 8,000 people joined the procession through the streets. 5,000 gathered at Calvary Cemetery in Evanston for the burial. The Catholic Church mobilized in the months that followed. Archbishop Patrick Feehan, under pressure from the press and from members of his own congregation, prepared a formal report on what he called the criminal acts of Clan Gael and submitted it to Cardinal Giovanni Simeoni in Rome. Pope Leo XIII authorized Archbishop Feehan to declare Clan Gael in direct opposition to the Church. Public meetings were held across Chicago to protest the existence of secret societies. Thousands attended. Gillian O'Brien, who wrote the most thorough modern account of the case, observed that by the time the trial concluded, very little that Clan Gael had kept secret was still secret. In 1929, 40 years after Cronin's death, the Chicago Tribune ran a contest. The newspaper offered $500 to any reader who could solve the mystery of the case. No one collected the prize.